Alright guys, for this video, we're going to take a suggestion from way back when, May 2nd, where Toledo Maroons wants to hear about Deontay Johnson. The reason I didn't make this initially is because I didn't think it was a topic that really needed to be discussed, but lately, Deontay Johnson has been skyrocketing up draft boards. I don't understand why. I'm going to try to kind of tamper the expectations a little bit for Deontay Johnson and try to get people to come down to earth on him. But do not bother commenting what you want me to talk about. I am not going to read the comment and think that, oh yeah, good idea, let me make a video for this guy. What I do is I make the video for the people on Patreon who have access to this Discord chat. I mean, the Discord chat's free to everybody, but only the people on Patreon have access to the video suggestions tab. And yeah, that's where we're going to go to continue to make these videos. So let's talk about Deontay Johnson.
That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
All right, guys, let's talk about Deontay Johnson. This is a player that's actually risen over 2 rounds of ADP in high-stakes fantasy football drafts since the NFL draft. And now this really perplexes me and completely stands out, and I don't understand it whatsoever. Yes, I know a lot of wide receivers in this range, such as Michael Gallup and others, kind of fell down draft boards a little bit because they welcomed competition from the NFL draft to their wide receiving core. But at the same time, guys, Deontay Johnson did as well. I don't know if you heard, but Chase Claypool was selected in the middle of the second round by the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 2020 NFL draft. And this is one of many reasons why I think Deontay Johnson is currently being overvalued. And let's get into why. So first, I'm going to talk about Deontay Johnson's overall profile. Then I'm going to focus in on what he did in 2019, which was really special. I don't want to say special. Actually, that was probably the wrong word. But it was better than expectations, and it was impressive from Deontay Johnson. So Deontay Johnson comes to the NFL Combine in the pre-draft process last offseason and test as a subpar athlete. But I say it all the time, with these wide receivers, I don't necessarily need to see them be top athletes. This isn't the running back position. Wide receivers can win basically with skill, and they don't really have to have a natural athletic ability to be one of the league's best. So his subpar athletic profile does not necessarily really scare me for Deontay Johnson. And also, he actually goes to the NFL draft and is selected in the early 3rd round where nobody really expected him to be. Most people had him pegged as a 5th, 6th, 7th rounder in the NFL draft if you looked at any mock draft data. But at the same time, Deontay Johnson goes in the early 3rd round, and dynasty owners are slow to react. And I actually came away with Deontay Johnson in a ton of rookie drafts last offseason, and Deontay Johnson may have been one of my highest owned rookies, similar to Terry McLaurin after last offseason. But guys, just like Terry McLaurin, I am also selling Deontay Johnson, and let's get into why. So the reason Deontay Johnson went this high in the NFL draft is because he was a great returner in college, and he's proven to be an above average returner at the NFL level. And while this is great for an immediate impact for these players, and while this is great to get them on the field and to really get them going, and it shows that they have the ability with the ball in their hands, it also really elevates their draft stock. So we really have to look at Deontay Johnson through a different lens. Deontay Johnson is similar to like a Henry Ruggs, where he can be a lot more useful for his NFL team than our fantasy teams, just because even if Deontay Johnson is not necessarily the Steelers' number 2 wide receiver in terms of targets, it doesn't necessarily matter because that early 3rd round pick could be well worth it for the Pittsburgh Steelers, considering what he offers on special teams. But nonetheless, that just kind of discounts where he was selected in the early 3rd round, whereas I don't necessarily want to hear a lot of people saying, oh, Deontay Johnson should have been a smash the entire time. Look at his profile. But if we zoom out and also look at his collegiate profile, we see that he did not have fantastic production at Toledo. And this is where I get concerned with Deontay Johnson. So his production didn't pop off the charts at a college where you would expect a great NFL wide receiver to really perform up to expectations, where he was just about above average compared to all the other players coming into the NFL draft. And this is not what you want to see from a player who went to a college like Toledo. And this is especially not what you want to see from a prospect who is as old as Deontay Johnson, who was 23 years old entering the NFL. And while all these are negative things on Deontay Johnson, while I know most of y'all are pretty much screaming at your phone right now, screaming at your laptop, whatever you're watching me on, say, Mason, you're an idiot, yada, yada, yada. Guys, let me kind of rebuttal and let me admit that Diontae Johnson had a great rookie season. He actually led the Steelers in receptions and was their target leader his rookie season. Now, this is something, I'll use the word, this is special for a rookie wide receiver to do. But at the same time, similar to my Terry McLaurin, similar to my Deebo Samuel, you have to understand how these players coming in at an older age, it really affects their rookie year production. While I'm not saying that Diontae Johnson coming in at 23 years old is scaring me off him because he's going to retire earlier than other wide receivers in that rookie class or anything, because that's just a foolish take, and nobody's going to say that because we're not projecting that far out. We only really care about the next 3 to 5 years tops. What I am saying is Diontae Johnson coming in at 23 years old kind of discounts his rookie production. And that if he was a 20-year-old like a Juju Smith-Schuster who was when coming into the NFL, or if he was 21 years old like A.J. Brown or DK Metcalf, one, he would be valued a lot higher in Dynasty right now for a great reason. But two, we would be able to really look at that rookie year production and say, oh my gosh, look at what he was able to do at 21 years old, at 20 years old, and look at what his ceiling could be. But when you come into the NFL and you are a 23-year-old prospect, you could still have an extremely high ceiling. I'm not going to say his ceiling is capped, but at the same time, I think it's harder to project an extremely high ceiling for a player that comes in at that age. Now, another thing, looking at his rookie season production, we have to understand what was going on in Pittsburgh. Yes, we know Big Ben goes down week 2, and we don't see him the rest of the year. They have potentially some of the worst quarterback play in the entire NFL in 2019, and we also see key injuries to their other passing game weapons, such as Juju Smith-Schuster. So I'm not going to sit here and argue with anybody trying to tell me that Diontae Johnson is more talented than Juju Smith-Schuster, because that would be a waste of breath. I'm going to just say it as if it's fact, and everybody should know it, that Juju Smith-Schuster is the wide receiver 1 on this team, and he would have been the wide receiver 1 in 2019 if it was not for him dealing with his injuries throughout the season. But nonetheless, let's look at the reception leaders for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2019 so we can have a better picture of what was going on. So, like I said earlier, Diontae Johnson, his rookie season, actually led the team in receptions. Extremely impressive to see. But second, we see Jalen Samuels, a hybrid type running back coming out of the backfield, being able to be second in terms of receptions on this team. That really shows where the receiving core was in 2019. Third, we see James Washington. Fourth, we see Juju Smith-Schuster. Then we see Vance McDonald and James Conner afterwards. So this is really highlighting that nobody else was there to take away targets from Diontae Johnson. And at the same time, you can make the argument that nobody was there to take pressure away from Diontae Johnson, and the defense was going to be able to focus in on him. And yes, you can make that argument, and that's completely fair. But at the same time, guys, we really overrate that factor of defenses keying in on a single player in terms of fantasy football. I know people, mainly analysts, I think it's driven by podcasters who don't really understand numbers and don't really understand where fantasy points come from, that kind of say that narrative and don't really understand what's going on. And I mean, it sounds smart. It sounds like you really know what you're talking about. But if you break down the numbers, it doesn't matter. I mean, if Diontae Johnson is still the wide receiver 1, it doesn't matter if he's facing the number 1 corner. It doesn't matter if the safety's coming over to help guard Diontae Johnson, which I'm telling you right now was not the case, because Diontae Johnson is not a player that's going to take the lid off the defense. It doesn't matter. Diontae Johnson was the number 1 target for Pittsburgh, so he was going to be in the best situation for his fantasy success in 2019, and still, we cannot take anything away from him because of it. But in 2019, let's look at what he was able to do in a per-game basis, because I think this is one reason that Diontae Johnson is kind of getting overrated at this point of the offseason, is a lot of people are looking at his yearly totals and where he finished among the wide receivers in total fantasy points. And like I say all the time, if you want to be a fool and look at these stats, you're going to be loading up on the Jason Wittens, the guys that have no ceiling, that are never going to win you a week in fantasy, yet they're going to stay healthy all 16 games, and you're going to go 8-8 in your fantasy league. But in 2019, Diontae Johnson averaged about a little over 3.5 receptions a game, about 3.7 receptions a game. a little over 40 yards a game, and he had 5 total touchdowns. But let's kind of key in on some efficiency metrics. That way we have a better idea of the type of wide receiver that Diontae Johnson is. In his rookie season, Diontae Johnson had 7.4 yards per target. This was actually 3rd on the team and 69th in the NFL. And he had 9 air yards per target, which was 81st in the NFL. I know I've referenced air yards a lot, but if you have not heard me do it before, air yards are essentially the yards that the wide receiver is targeted down the field. So if Diontae Johnson runs a slant and he catches it 8 yards down the field, then he runs another 8 yards after the catch. He's accredited 8 air yards in that situation, and yards after the catch are not. So looking at this, we're able to kind of figure out where Diontae Johnson is operating on the field, and this is closer to the line of scrimmage. And really, that does not necessarily matter for fantasy football. I mean, I'm fine loading up on guys that line up and run routes close to the line of scrimmage if they're going to score fantasy points, but we're trying to project what's going to happen with Ben Roethlisberger coming back in 2020, and yeah. But now let's look at James Washington, let's look at Juju Smith-Schuster, and let's look at Chase Claypool and try to figure out what's going to be going on in 2020 in Pittsburgh. So first, let's start with James Washington, who feels like it has been around in the league forever. He came out in the Nick Chubb rookie class, and he's going into year 3. But James Washington is actually only 3 months older than Diontae Johnson. I know I've referenced Diontae Johnson's age a lot in this video, but I'm trying to put into context how old he was coming out of college. But James Washington is going into year 3. He actually averaged 9.2 yards per target in 2019 compared to Diontae Johnson's 7.4. Now, this isn't necessarily a stat that's going to show, oh, James Washington is this much more efficient than Diontae Johnson. Look how much better he is than Diontae Johnson. And it's a little misleading just because James Washington is running routes farther down the field. So, of course, his targets are going to naturally be more efficient. But let's zoom out a little bit and let's look at James Washington's full profile. And if we look at what he was able to do in college, he was actually able to accrue way more production in the Big 12 compared to Diontae Johnson at Toledo. And not only was he able to accrue way more production, but at the same time, he was actually able to be a Biletnikoff winner. And we see that historically, they really translate to be successful NFL players. And we also see that James Washington has a similar team investment into him as Diontae Johnson. Diontae Johnson was selected with the 2nd pick in the 3rd round, and James Washington was selected at the very end of the 2nd round. So essentially, they have the same exact team investment. James Washington was a more productive college player. He's been more efficient at the NFL level so far, and they are essentially the same exact age. I'm not here saying that James Washington is a better fantasy asset than Diontae Johnson, because Diontae Johnson is going to be a guy that's going to get more targets when he's on the field compared to James Washington. But it's important to keep in mind that James Washington is not significantly worse than Diontae Johnson. If anything, he could be more valuable to the Pittsburgh Steelers than Diontae Johnson. Now, let's focus in on the star of this offense, Juju Smith-Schuster. Going into year 4, I actually sent out a tweet earlier today, but I found out that going into year 4, Juju Smith-Schuster is actually younger than Diontae Johnson, who was just a rookie. This is kind of hilarious, and it just highlights really what Juju has been able to accomplish so far in his NFL career, puts him on an historic pace to be one of the best NFL wide receivers ever. I know a lot of people are low on Juju Smith-Schuster right now, especially with the reports that Pittsburgh could be looking to move on from him after the 2021 season. But guys, I'm here to say that Juju Smith-Schuster is not going to leave Pittsburgh. I think a lot would have to happen for them to be willing to move on from Juju. If he's going to hit the market at 24 years old in his prime, I don't really understand it. I know a lot of people want to point to Emmanuel Sanders saying, oh, look, they weren't afraid to let Emmanuel Sanders go, but Emmanuel Sanders was not in the same class of Juju Smith-Schuster when he was leaving Pittsburgh. But now let's focus in on their most recent addition to this offense in Chase Claypool. And what's funny is Chase Claypool actually has the most team investment into him out of all 4 of these wide receivers. Not necessarily too important, but it is noteworthy that Chase Claypool is not just some bum that they picked up at the end of the NFL draft. They went out there, they really invested into him. They decided that he was going to be able to be a playmaker for this offense, and for good reason. We look at Chase Claypool's profile, and really Chase Claypool is highly athletic. He's a massive wide receiver who's extremely athletic and has an extremely high ceiling. And I think that they are viewing Chase Claypool as the long-term wide receiver 2 in Pittsburgh. And I think that he's going to be the replacement for James Washington. So I know I was kind of saying that James Washington may be a better wide receiver than Diontae Johnson, but at this point, I think it's kind of foolish to say that James Washington is in the Pittsburgh Steelers' long-term plans while Diontae Johnson is not, after Diontae Johnson leads the team in receptions his rookie season. But overall, I think we're looking at this team a year from now, and we see Chase Claypool playing on the outside, Juju Smith-Schuster, Diontae Johnson, both playing on the outside and switching into the slot. I don't know who's necessarily going to get more slot snaps, but we know Juju and Diontae, they both operate greatly at that position. But let's focus in on 2020 and try to project what's going to happen with the wide receivers in this offense, because that's going to greatly affect their dynasty value a year from now. But obviously, you cannot project anybody else other than Juju Smith-Schuster to be the wide receiver 1 on this team. I expect Juju to be the wide receiver 1, and I don't expect it to be close. I'm loading up on him everywhere I can in Dynasty, and I can tell you right now, his price will be higher this time next offseason than it is now. I am certain of that. Then Diontae Johnson, second in targets, closely followed by James Washington, third, Jalen Samuels, fourth, Eric Ebron, fifth, and Chase Claypool, sixth. So looking at this order of targets, the main thing to point out is there is significantly more competition for Diontae Johnson in 2020 than there was in 2019. Yes, we can project the offense to be better with Ben Roethlisberger coming back. Yes, we can project Diontae Johnson to be better going into his second season at the NFL level. But I think due to the increased competition, Diontae Johnson may just be more efficient with the targets that he gets and may not necessarily get many more targets than he saw his rookie season. So Diontae Johnson should be a better fantasy asset in 2020 than 2019, but I don't think it will be by much, and I'm not going to be willing to go out there and pay the price for Diontae Johnson. But thanks, guys. Really hope y'all enjoyed the video. Really hope y'all got something from it. And I know a lot of people are probably going to be upset with this. Please, if you are, leave a comment and leave an explanation why you think that Diontae Johnson is a good buy at his current dynasty price. But yeah, that's all I got for y'all. Have a great day.